Well, good morning and good evening for all who are attending today. I'm Merit Janow, Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs, and it's an enormous personal and professional privilege to launch today the Richard N. Gardner Professorship at SIPA and introduce its first incumbent. On a personal note, let me start by saying that it's really been a joy as Dean to work to create the Richard Gardner Professorship, both to honor the individual, a distinguished academic, a respected diplomat, and a forceful policy advocate, and also the worldview that he represents that remains so very needed in the world today. On a personal note, I was a student of Professor Gardner at Columbia Law School in the 1980s, and I took his famous seminar on legal aspects of U.S. foreign economic policy. In fact, it was one of the reasons I applied to Columbia Law School, coming as I was with a background in economics, Japan, and China, and wanting to combine those things, law, international economics, and policy. Professor Gardner helped to create the field of international economic law, starting with his groundbreaking work on sterling dollar diplomacy. He was a lawyer and an economist, and the seminar I mentioned was, by the way, I think the longest running ever. He was a mentor, a friend, a colleague for over 3 decades, and an incredibly generous teacher with an enormous following around the world with whom he kept actively in touch. In the early 1990s, when I served in Washington at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative responsible for Japan and China, I recall several memorable Gardner dinner gatherings of alumni in Washington. A decade later, in the early 2000s, when I was on the appellate body of the WTO in Geneva, I went to a similar gathering in Europe where he brought together former students serving in embassies and governments in the UN system, in international tribunals. And I remember that night debating whether China joining the WTO would change China or China the WTO. Professor Gardner was an open-minded intellectual who made enormous contributions across numerous areas. And I think it's fair to say he was a multilateralist, a believer in the value of working towards a rules-based international order. His interests and contributions were very broad-ranging, notably the United Nations, international security, human rights, law of the sea, space, the environment, and much more. Hence the breadth of the discussion that will follow today. And to me, he represented a view of America in the world that was fundamentally cosmopolitan. And he was also deeply expert, of course, in European affairs and served important bilateral roles as the US ambassador to Italy and Spain. At Columbia University, while Professor Gardner was based at the law school, his policy involvement was so substantial and wide-ranging that he generously and very proactively included many SIPA students in his seminar every year. He helped launch at SIPA our International Fellows Program in 1960, and even taught his basic course on the US and world affairs, and served for at least a decade on the SIPA Advisory Board. For all these reasons and more, I'm grateful to Dean Lester and Columbia Law School for letting us take the lead in building the Gardner Chair, and I wish to acknowledge and thank today the enormous generosity of Leonard Lauder, a friend of Dick Gardner, for his instrumental support of this chair, as well as the important and generous support of several members of SIPA's advisory board, as well as Richard Gardner's family and friends, and more than 150 of his former students and colleagues, many of whom are with us today. Richard Gardner led a life between the academy and public service. He took academic learning out into the world, and he imagined a world of well-functioning international institutions. He thought about approaches to reduce conflict and support global growth and stability, and he was a global citizen, thinking creatively about looming challenges, both domestic and international. This is a worldview that remains important in this time in the world. And it feels particularly fitting to me to have the first incumbent of the Gardner chair, our distinguished Jan Svejnar. Jan Svejnar is an international economist whose own life has spanned public service and the academy, the United States and Europe. His scholarship is focused on the transition economies of Europe, on the effects of government policies on firms, labor, and capital markets, and on corporate and global governance. He also runs at SIPA our Center on Global Economic Governance, known for its extremely high quality convening and comparative research on some of the most significant challenges facing Europe, the United States, and Asia. You will have a chance to hear from him shortly. But first, it's my great pleasure to invite Dean Gillian Lester of Columbia Law School to offer a few introductory remarks today. I've been grateful to collaborate with Dean Lester on numerous fronts, and especially during this long, dark period of COVID. She has been for me an important academic partner and a leader in our community of deans, for which, Gillian, you have my admiration and my deep appreciation. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Merritt. It's so fitting for you to kick off today's event. Not only were you Professor Gardner's student, but also your career has followed an arc that tracks his very closely, moving between the academy and government and holding important institutional leadership positions along the way. So let me in turn take this opportunity to thank you for your leadership and wish you all the best as you conclude your deanship at SIPA. I hope you know that that does not mean that you are excused from continuing to teach in the law school. We so appreciate your presence.
Thank you.
It's a true honor for me to welcome our panelists and attendees on behalf of the law school. As all of you know, Richard was Columbian for an astonishing 6 decades, and he made his intellectual home at the law school. And he taught that seminal course, Legal Aspects of US Foreign Policy, from 1955 through 2012 when he retired, to generations of future lawyers, Columbia-trained lawyers, and Columbia-trained, legally trained global public servants. And his teaching was only interrupted by the occasional sabbatical or when a US president came calling to ask him to serve as ambassador. He did 2 tours, first as ambassador to Italy under President Carter, and then as ambassador to Spain under Bill Clinton. And I know many of you here today in the audience, as well as on the panel, were shaped by Dick's teaching, which was so richly informed by the texture of his work in government. The diaspora of devoted students he taught in the law school was broad, deep, his influence indelible. And even if you weren't a student of his, if you work in his fields, you were almost certainly influenced by his contributions. Former provost and former SIPA Dean John Coatsworth might have said it best when he introduced Dick at the conference held in honor of his retirement in 2012. And I quote, "No one else I know has managed to be a scholar, lawyer, teacher, policymaker, economist, diplomat, institution builder, comedian, and raconteur, all without resorting to reincarnation." Dick was indeed an academic, public servant, colleague, and human being of the first order. And Columbia Law School, SIPA, and the university are better for his membership within our community. Something I want to emphasize, and I'm sure will come across in today's remarks, was how forward-thinking Dick was, a voice ahead of his time. He wrote about global trade, multilateral democracy, and sounded a clarion call to address environmental degradation long before climate change entered our common parlance. Some of you might remember this excerpt from when I shared it at Dick's memorial service in 2019, but I continue to be struck by the relevance of his words. In a speech he once gave on the legacy of FDR, Dick lauded the former president and a hero of his as a leader who, quote, would ask us not to abandon hope in the face of our current disappointments, nor seek refuge from our frustrations in a cynical passivity, but to meet our daunting challenges through creative and cooperative action. In a modern world deeply divided, Dick's words endure as a guidepost for the future of the democratic order. And the talk and panel that will follow shortly will speak directly to this plea from Dick for optimism and collaboration in international law and affairs. The establishment of a faculty chair named in Richard's honor is such a wonderful tribute, and it's a source of pride for all of us here at Columbia. I want to congratulate Jan on taking up this appointment, and to all those who will speak today. It's now my great pleasure to hand the podium to another one of Dick's students, an international affairs expert and teacher who has followed in his footsteps, his daughter, Nina Gardner.
Thank you, Dean Lester. I want to thank both deans for their kind words, and particularly Dean Janow for carrying this over the finish line. Launching professorships these days is not an easy task, and we have many people to thank, especially our dear friend Leonard Lauder, and many, many of my friends and classmates who generously contributed to this chair. I'm sorry my brother Tony could not be here for the launch, but I'm here to represent the Gardner siblings, both of us students of his, and both of us have found different ways of honoring our father's legacy in our professional lives. Much has been said already by the deans, but I wanted to cover again Dad's legacy in the various multilateral institutions and organizations, which he held especially close to his heart, because he understood that global problems regard global solutions, binding the broadest possible group of nations. And he saw these potential conflicts on the horizon and tried to find international solutions, and they are incredibly relevant today. He was a true futurist. He worked on I'm going to go in order, a chronological order, because just going through what the breadth of the issues he worked on is extraordinary. So in the 60s, during the Sputnik era, he worked on sort of the race to the moon, which is very valid with the Space Force we have now created. And he was one of the early drafters of the Outer Space Treaty, which was finalized in 1967. But he was working on that first draft at the Rand Corporation in the summer of 1960, which is why this New Yorker was born in Santa Monica, California. He worked on world hunger, and with George McGovern was instrumental in establishing the World Food Program in 1961. He was very proud of having flagged the delicate issue of population growth in 1963, when, as U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations, he helped craft a U.S. statement on the whole issue of limits to growth and population growth with President Kennedy, a Catholic. He was instrumental also in creating the UN peacekeeping operations and getting US support for that very important program in 1966. He was very concerned on resource grabs in the seabed, and therefore contributed a great deal to the drafting of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which was adopted finally in 1982. Which lays down a comprehensive regime of law and order on the world's oceans and seas, which the US has yet to sign and is being pilloried by the GOP. His main causes were, as has been mentioned, in the field of human rights and the environment. On human rights, I think he was an ardent admirer of Eleanor Roosevelt, and his meeting and interview with her in 1952 left an indelible mark. When he was at state during the Kennedy administration, he tried to get the US to ratify the human rights treaties, especially the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and was unsuccessful because it's never been signed, or ratify the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. But he tried. But he claimed, and this is an important quote from the quotable Gardner, which he put together and gave to us. Our power in the world derives not just from our position as an arsenal of weapons or as a storehouse of commodities, but as a society that seeks the universal realization of the dignity of man. And he truly believed and lived this. He campaigned also to get the US to sign and ratify the Genocide Convention, 1988. And on the environmental front, we lived all of these environmental conferences. He was a delegate in 1972, the Stockholm Conference, and I was present in the peanut gallery, making me probably the youngest person alive who has been to Stockholm, Rio, and Rio plus 20. But he also went to Rio on the US delegation with John Kerry, was very proud of that, and has been active on the environmental front throughout his life. But most important, he was committed to teaching that next generation. Now, teaching multilateralism began at home, just wanted to let you know. His first students were my brother and I, and we got used to having a manganese nodule on our dining room table. And he used that to discuss the importance of creating a regulatory regime for the seabed. You know, who is going to mine? What are we going to do? Who is going to grab? And he went to the elementary schools of both my brother and myself, and even his grandson Lawrence's, to ask the questions, easy questions to kids, like who owns the sea? And prompting him with other questions like, does God own it? First come, first serve? Does it belong to the UN? And he left his mark, as we know, on thousands and thousands of his Columbia students around the world who are carrying forward the ideals he instilled in him. He was so proud as they excelled in their careers, and as was said, he kept in touch with them, and they loved him. I have this Dear Professor Gardner compilation of 80 letters spanning from 1957 to 2013 that flowed in when my father retired in 2013. And even this Thanksgiving, I went to a friend's house, and discussing my father, the person went and dug up a paper that my dad had commented on. And this is not unusual. Many of these students I know around the world still keep his papers and their comments, and that's how much they really cared about him. But I'll close these brief remarks with this. It's critically important to teach the next generation that a go-at-it-alone approach to tackle the challenges of the time is definitely not the way to handle the complex international issues that are coming at us headlong. During the pandemic slowdown, I ventured out of my New York, DC bubble and spent time listening to hours of right-wing radio rants against the evils of global governance, with the World Bank, the IMF, the WHO, and of course the UN as their primary whipping boys. While there has always been some misunderstanding about the nature of interdependence and multilateralism, and I remember my dad being less than charitable regarding the likes of Strom Thurmond from Senate, South Carolina, the danger of these beliefs becoming more widespread is real, which is all the more reasons that institutions like Columbia create chairs like the Gardner Professorship to train our leaders of tomorrow. I wish Professor Svejnar all the best. This is a very big responsibility to carry on your shoulders, but I'm sure you will do a phenomenal job.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Gillian. And thank you, Merit, for a wonderful introduction and thoughtful discussion of Richard Gardner's life and his accomplishments. Truly amazing. I am delighted to be here today to join in remembering and honoring the legacy of Richard Gardner. Indeed, a career that spanned so many areas: law, academia, government, journalism, public service, diplomacy. And in all that, he has really been a model for many of us, generations indeed, of people working in these areas. And so I'm particularly pleased to be the founding holder of the chair that bears his name, and indeed feel very honored to be in that position. I think that it's important to stress, in addition to what has already been said, that he understood very deeply many of the issues that face international community, and that his expertise was intellectual as well as pragmatic, that he really, in his assignments and in the various realms of public service, provided exemplary vision in what needed to be done, how things needed to be conceptualized and indeed then implemented. It resonated with me in my own work as an academic, teacher, advisor to policymakers, that indeed we have many parallels in the work that we've done, be it in transatlantic issues, issues relating to Europe and Europe and the United States, global trade and finance, and building multilateral frameworks for finding solutions. So in that sense, his work really has been remarkable relative to many other people who have made great contributions. And indeed, as was already mentioned, the Center on Global Economic Governance, which I have the privilege of directing here at SIPA, has many of these features built into its own character. It was founded after the 2008 financial crisis, and it has served as a forum for leading academics at Columbia, as well as external academics and policymakers and business leaders, to address some of the important issues, serve as a forum for research, as well as discussion and implementation of actionable policy type proposals. So I feel particularly fortunate that both the chair itself and the center really are in such congruence that they indeed do serve a similar purpose and therefore will reinforce each other. Let me just maybe say that also Richard Gardner's vision was very prescient on many critical issues that are really important today, that in some sense his approaches and his principles are relevant for issues about global pandemic that we face, the climate change issues, tensions, global scale tensions that we have now, and concerns about human rights and migration. So let me conclude my remarks at the beginning here to thank Dean Janow, Dean Lester Law School, and Richard Gardner's family and friends for participating in this endeavor and being here with us today. And I think that it's time that I would like to now turn to our speakers and let them provide the contribution that we expect in terms of the intellectual endeavors that they have been working on. So let me start with Jeffrey Sachs, who is the university professor at Columbia. He is well known for many of his activities working with institutions such as the United Nations and other multilateral institutions. He's also the director for the Center for Sustainable Development here at Columbia, and indeed is associated with some of the major ideas and implementation of international development. So his thoughts have been really implemented in many countries around the world. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Jan, thank you very much. Thank you for having me part of this celebration of your induction into the chair, and a time to honor and remember the great leadership of Richard Gardner. He was, for so many of us, just a great inspiration of a wonderful person, and you looked at him and his learning and said, God, I want to be able to do something like that. That is so phenomenal, so much fun, so interesting. How can someone know all those things? How can it be so exciting? And the dinners that I was so lucky to be part of with Nina, always as phenomenal hostess, and they were just absolutely thrilling, scintillating. So I am here this morning with lots of joy and great remembrances, and I want to get from Nina the quotable Gardner, because I want to make sure that I know and propagate the quotable Gardner for the years ahead. And Jan, it's phenomenal that you're taking this chair, and completely wonderfully fitting, because the breadth of your interests and experience and knowledge are perfect, a perfect fit for the chair, from the first times that I've known you, you've not only obviously impressed me, but also impressed me with the breadth of your interests and your expertise and all the things you work on, and exactly in line with that remarkable scope of Richard's interests. Now, he was one of the great shapers and conceptualizers of American leadership at the time of America's coming to global leadership. And his great opening book on sterling dollar diplomacy is so much fun and thrilling because it's really the story of the emergence of the US as a global financial and monetary leader, and all the hiccups and missteps and challenges and difficulties about that. And for me, by the way, as a trained monetary economist, it brought the heart and soul of monetary economics alive, because you learn a lot of equations, but you don't learn what it's really about. And that book taught us what it's really about. It's about monetary theory and monetary systems, but it's about power and politics, geopolitics, who runs the world, who no longer runs the world, what happens in a transformation and a transition from British leadership of the international system to American leadership of the international system. And that book is so relevant. It, of course, has stayed completely alive for the 64 years since it was first published. But it's completely relevant again today, because we're in one of those great eras of geopolitical change. We don't know where it's heading, but clearly the old era of the more or less uncontested US dominance of a large part of the world in terms of shaping the international system doesn't apply anymore. A large part of America doesn't participate constructively, as Nina was saying, is antithetical to the values of multilateralism, says it's our way or no way. And at the same time, there are real challenges in the world, whether we like it or not, from a new multipolar world and a lack of shared understanding of what the world should be. And I think we're going to see, and I hope you will take up at the center and in the chair, precisely the monetary and financial aspects of this issue, among many others. But the dollar, which came to global dominance in the story that Richard Gardner tells in that book, should no longer be supposed to have that dominance in the future. We don't know, of course, the future of the international monetary system, but I think that there are three pertinent, large factors that should give us the need for a deep reflection. The first, obviously, is the relative decline of US economic power in the world, simply the share of the United States in the world economy, the uniqueness of US technological know-how, which were features of the 1950s, certainly no longer apply. The US was 25 to 30% of world output when Dick Gardner was writing his classic. It's closer to around 15% today, depending, of course, on what precise measurements one uses. We are not the indisputable technological leader by any stretch of the imagination. And this means that the underpinning of technology and economic power behind the US as the world's key currency has diminished tremendously. Obviously, with the rise of the euro, as well. In any event, the proportionate role of the US, or the unique role of the US in the international monetary system, was diminishing, though its share in transactions and settlements remains huge. The second phenomenon, obviously, is the rise of China. So a global system competitor, I hope and I believe a cooperator, as we talked about a couple of days ago in the wonderful Columbia China conference, which was a wonderful gathering and a demonstration of the depths of the collegiality and the friendships between us and China that are so important. But no doubt the rise of China will mean the rise of the renminbi as an important international currency. And just 2 days ago, it was reported that President Xi Jinping and President Vladimir Putin discussed systematically how to move away from the US-based settlement system. And one of the reasons for that is that one of the privileges of the US key currency role is the power to impose unilateral sanctions through the financial system. But there are workarounds, and there will be workarounds. And we should not suppose that that power, which has been very widely used, not so wisely used, I would add, but widely used, will be maintained. The third major trend, of course, is that money itself is under a profound transformation in the digital age. We will have various kinds of digital currencies. We probably will start with the digital renminbi as the first large-scale state-backed digital currency. This will change the nature of banking, settlements, and global power, because what Richard Gardner taught us is that with finance goes power, and that these two cannot be separated, even though we may have different departments of economics and government, we have an interconnected whole. So I think we are in an era where the role of the dollar will diminish in its preeminence, will change in its character, and will be, as Richard taught us to think, deeply interconnected in geopolitics. What he represented above all was the idea that we should not sit back and observe or even predict, but try to create something that is useful, cooperative, peace-building, multilateral for humanity. And so I would say we have a major challenge ahead of a new Bretton Woods era, indeed. I think that we are at the start of, it won't be a Bretton Woods 2 because it won't be on the porch of Bretton Woods Hotel, but it is a time for a reconstruction. And we need Richard's inimitable wisdom and your leadership, Jan, to help us find a way to make a new international monetary and financial system that serves the whole world, serves peace, and serves sustainable development. Thank you for letting me be part of today's celebration.
Thank you very much, Jeff. This was very inspirational and indeed right on target. I think it's a perfect tribute to Richard in the sense that indeed he documented and explained and drew implications from the transition from the British pound and British dominance of the international trading system to the US dominance. And we are indeed at a turning point, as you've explained. And yes, indeed, as euro emerged and became the second reserve currency virtually overnight, and now with renminbi beginning to play a much more important role and the institutional changes that are taking place, I think you've really gone right on the mark. That's where we need to go. And I think it's also a perfect segue for our second speaker, Tom Christensen, who is the James T. Shotwell Professor of International Affairs here at SIPA and also the incoming interim dean of SIPA. So it's both time to welcome him starting on January 1st and to thank Merit Janow for her tremendous service and leadership that she has provided to SIPA over the last decade. And so with that, Tom, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Jan. I wanted to start by congratulating you for being the inaugural holder of the Gardner Chair. And thank you, Merit and Nina, for allowing me to speak here today. I know that Ambassador Gardner taught in the law school about legal aspects of U.S. foreign economic policy, and I'm an international security scholar, so I'm going to focus on the security aspects of U.S. foreign economic policy. And I want to start with a lament that the United States has turned away from globalization and turned away from multilateral economic agreements in a way that I think is damaging to U.S. national security, particularly since 2016 and 17. And one of the consensus positions across the aisle in Washington is that China joining the WTO was a bad thing for the United States. And I think that's a false narrative. I think it's based in some misconceptions about the situation before China joined. And the situation before China joined is that the United States was wide open to trade from China, and China joining the WTO opened up opportunities for U.S. businesses in China that were not there before. And the best evidence of that is that U.S. exports to China grew significantly faster than imports from China after China joined the WTO up until the Trump administration. And this has security implications because when China joined the WTO, ironically, the Asian neighbors of China became more convinced that a trade war between the United States and China was less likely. And as a result, they invested even more into China in manufacturing in ways that increased intra-regional interdependence in East Asia. So products are produced in multiple countries in East Asia. Parts are sold in from Japan and South Korea and Malaysia, Singapore into China. They're assembled there and sent back out. And I believe that this phenomenon, this transnational production chain that was facilitated by China joining the WTO, it wasn't created by it, but it was a catalyst in the direction where things were already headed, has produced peace in East Asia. It's a major force for peace. Very difficult to demonstrate because it's a counterfactual. But I can't believe when I look at East Asia, you have a region with structural change, the rise of China, as Jeff discussed. You have very different forms of government, which is often a source of conflict. You have authoritarian regimes next to democratic regimes. And you have unsettled legacies of history, particularly the legacies of World War II, which are highly contentious in the region. And on top of that, you have lots of sovereignty disputes. Lots and lots of sovereignty disputes, particularly at sea. And we have seen no major interstate war in East Asia since 1979. And I can't help believe that this transnational production chain, which has produced a lot of wealth, but is also recognized as being very fragile, has not contributed to that peace in East Asia in a way that serves U.S. national security interests. And the second aspect that I wanted to talk about today is U.S. foreign policy, not just the multilateral situation. And that is that the Biden administration came into office, and I think they quite correctly wanted to repair U.S. relationships with allies and partners around the world. They had been damaged during the Trump administration, and they understood that U.S. allies and partnerships alliances and partnerships are a great source of competitive strength for the United States around the world. And restoring those would allow them to approach China, as they put it, from a position of strength. The problem with that strategy so far as I can see, is there's really no economic component to that strategy. And for the Asian partners and allies, economics is really essential to their well-being and their foreign policies. So it's a real shame. And it's not that everybody has pulled away from globalization and interdependence. As the economist Adam Posen has said very well in his Foreign Affairs article, the rest of the world continues to integrate. It's the United States that's pulled away. In East Asia, there was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Obama administration was negotiating entrance into that, but both parties turned away from it, and President Trump pulled out. Now there's the CPTPP, which is the follow-on organization. The United States is not involved in that, but most of the major economies in East Asia are involved in that. And you have RCEP, an agreement of initially of 15 countries in East Asia, more than a third of global GNP. And the United States is not involved in that. And now we have the digital economy agreement in Asia, involving a lot of Asian countries, and the United States is not involved in that. So the problem with that is that it harms the broad grand strategy of the Biden administration in strengthening ties with allies and partners when the economic component is missing. And I think that absence is almost universally noted in East Asia. And it's a real shame. And I don't have a prescription for how to get Republicans and Democrats back on board with a confident attitude towards multilateral economic institutions and understanding that when we're not involved in those institutions, they're shaped without our influence. And I'll end with that and just say it's a real honor to speak with you today. And thank you again, Jan, Merit, and Nina for including me, a security person in an economic panel. And I'll turn it over back to Jan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. And I should have mentioned right at the beginning, as you have gathered, Tom is the foremost expert on China and Asia and international relations relating to China, US, and other countries, multilateral issues. So it's great to have him here also with the real world experience, having served in multiple bodies, including the US State Department. So Tom, thank you. Thank you very much. This was very important. And I think the fact that the US has receded from the international arena, and both towards the Pacific, Asian countries, towards Europe, still hasn't rebuilt bridges and the transatlantic partnerships very much that Richard Gardner has worked on so assiduously. I think that is a real shortcoming and a major problem, which if not remedied, if not paid attention to, will have serious long-term consequences. So let me turn now to Nina Gardner, whom you've already heard from at the beginning. She is a professor, adjunct professor at the School of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins University, very active in the academic field, but also very active in policy, a number of policy arenas, business areas, focusing on ESG, the environmental, social governance type issues, in addition to many other areas. So Nina, the floor is yours. You work on so many issues that you'll have to somehow figure out what you're going to focus on today.
Well, yes, I don't have as much to choose from as my father, because that was everything. I'm going to focus on the two targets of economic policy and diplomacy that I think we need to address now. One of them, the broad buckets, are planetary sustainability through climate and environmental diplomacy. And the other is human sustainability by protecting human rights and promoting the development of human potential. And to focus on that sustainability element here, we only have a decade to implement climate diplomacy. Mitigation, adaptation, innovation needs to be front and center of our foreign policy. None of this can be done separately, and we are literally running out of time. This means we need to continue and step up our multilateral approach to the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and we can do better than COP26. And hopefully next year in Cairo, there will be more commitments, especially for climate adaptation in developing countries. Ironically, we heard more important commitments coming from the financial community than from governments. And with greater government incentives for the business sector, we can really get much more traction. We also need to address the implications of climate change on peace and security. We are just seeing the beginnings of nations imploding due to the strains on states who will not be able to provide a livable environment for their citizens. When masses of people start walking for their lives, and many already are, we have to have and work on immediately a global migration policy. This issue is not going away. And yes, all governments need to provide economic incentives to companies to come up with innovative solutions and share best practices. There are companies that have already found ways to capture carbon from the atmosphere to make gasoline and even yoga mats. These breakthrough technologies need to be brought to scale faster. We need to be more ambitious and we need to accelerate implementation. This would help many countries leapfrog to new technologies and give them the benefit of our cutting edge innovation and create disincentives for those who prefer to spend their know-how on mad Mars capers as if there were a planet B. Even with countries where we have a fraught relationship like Iran, where we have a shared adversary, why not capitalize on a joint interest in combating climate change? Iran stated in the climate conference in Glasgow that sanctions are preventing it from reducing greenhouse gas emissions, an agreement that eased US sanctions related directly to mitigating climate change could probably provide some momentum toward a wider engagement of the 2015 deal. In parallel, we need to work together on robust environmental diplomacy, work together to promote a circular economy based on recycling and upcycling, making sure we banish all plastics that are not biodegradable from our planet and expand land uses for regenerative agriculture. There are so many best practices to be shared, and we can jointly craft policies to incentivize their development. All of this needs a focus also on human sustainability. Part of this means that in our rush toward a green transition, and this is difficult, we must make sure that we maintain a rights-based approach that does not marginalize people. We need to have equitable solutions to create sustainable livelihoods for Indigenous peoples and coal miners. And we must need an all hands on deck help to ensure that our transition to renewables, we do not lose sight of the children in conflict states like the DRC, who are mining for that much needed cobalt in our batteries, or the Indigenous peoples of the Atacama Desert who live on water-strained but lithium-rich land, or for that matter, the oppressed Uyghurs who are producing much of the polysilicon that is needed for solar panels. So US economic policy and human rights diplomacy must be focused on the protection also of workers' rights, including the elimination of forced and child labor and promoting freedom of association. Many of you may be aware of Section 307 of the US Tariff Act, which is an excellent example of how important trade regulations can make a huge impact and make a statement that the US will not accept goods from factories and regions, in the case of Xinjiang, that are product of forced labor, especially where that rises to the level of genocide. We should also work alongside our EU allies to reinforce their ambitious upcoming directive mandating human rights and environmental due diligence through their company supply chains. And this is a very significant directive. As you may have heard, the Biden administration has this new multilateral partnership for organizing worker empowerment and rights, the Empower Initiative that was launched at the Democracy Summit by the Secretary of Labor, Marty Walsh, to advance workplace democracy and freedom of association around the world. And that's another example of policy initiative that can support workers around the world. And we also need to address the importance of gender equality. This theme too was front and center at the Biden Democracy Summit, with comments from Ambassador Catherine Tai, our new US trade rep, on how gender equality was an important policy goal, both at home and abroad. And as we know from upteen studies, that greater gender equality leads to greater global prosperity, and that countries with greater gender inequality are more likely to face poverty, violence, and authoritarianism. So educating and empowering women and children, eliminating gender-based violence is win-win on all levels. As a corollary, and I'm almost done, we must encourage women's entrepreneurship. Most women's startups, and I'm on the board of an exceptional one called Farm from a Box, are focused on addressing one or more of the SDGs, so a win-win. Similarly, we need to facilitate more venture capital going to women-run startups. Today, a mere 2%, and that's an embarrassment. The federal government can do a great deal already by requiring that all public procurement take most of the environmental and rights-based considerations I just mentioned into account when selecting companies to purchase from. The spend in fiscal year 2020 was $665 billion, to give you an order of magnitude, and pressure of that magnitude down through the national supply chains would be massive. To conclude, America prides itself in being a leader on so many fronts, but we can only lead by example. Right now, there's a lot of work to be done on the critical issues I've mentioned, from climate and environmental policies to policies focused on human capital at home. So we must strive to lead abroad again, but we will only enhance our credibility if we demonstrate improvement in the US. A tough task, but I believe we're up to it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nina. You've really provided, I think, a terrific account and analytical insight into what needs to be done. And it's great that your work very nicely relates to the work that has been done by Jeff Sachs and other people here and within the SIPA community. So it indeed is, I think, very important, both reminding us of the limited time that's available, the need for government incentives to help institutions and businesses to provide the so far incomplete attention to migration issues. They haven't been as pronounced as they will be going forward. So it's surprising that the governments actually have not been better prepared. And it is definitely a reminder that much needs to be done here. The scaling up of some of the technological breakthroughs, which will make the policy in the direction in which we're going both more credible and feasible. I think those are very important issues. And in terms of focusing on equity, human issues, children, as you say, indigenous people, very often being given short shrift in consideration that we have. So indeed, labor, gender issues are very important here. So thank you very much for bringing this to the fore and giving us food for thought on that. Let me introduce our next speaker, who is Jacob Liu, who is visiting professor of international public affairs here at SIPA at Columbia. Very illustrious career, as many of you know. He served as the Secretary of Treasury, head of the Office of Management and Budget, and many other areas where he's left indelible mark. So, Jack, it's great to have you here. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Jan. I'm delighted to participate in this inaugural colloquium and to congratulate you on becoming the initial holder of the Gardner Chair. And thank you to Merritt and Nina Gardner for inviting me to contribute to this panel. While I didn't know Professor Gardner well, our careers intersected many times. From my first official overseas trip when I met him as our ambassador in Rome, to his many students from Tony Blinken to Andrew Shapiro, who became close colleagues and friends, to Tamara Lozado, who has been a colleague and friend for decades. I'm truly honored to be part of this panel to pay tribute to an extraordinary career of service and scholarship. The unipolar world of the post-Cold War period is over. Today, we live in a shifting multipolar world that represents new challenges in terms of economic policy and diplomacy, against a backdrop of accelerating technological change and an abundance of transnational challenges. There is no longer parity between the poles of global power, but there are asymmetric risks where traditional metrics of economic and military strength create disparate risk that's hard to detect and control. Still, the United States not only retains primacy across spheres, but it also remains the single best source of stability and security in a changing world. But to ensure that that remains the case requires that our approach recognize and reflect the new multipolar reality. In terms of economic policy, no other economy offers the stability and strength of the United States, which means there's no immediate challenge to the dollar as the world reserve currency. While some countries have taken steps at the margin to circumvent the dollar system, at least today, no other country is ready to replace the dollar. When you look at the RMB, in the same week that Presidents Putin and Xi underscored collaboration to be an alternative to the dollar, China's political leadership underscored that the People's Bank of China follows political guidance, a practice that is fundamentally inconsistent with assuming the privileged position that the US has enjoyed since World War II. And digital sovereign currency, in the end, is not more capable of replacing the dollar than traditional paper currency. Doesn't mean it won't change, but a snapshot of where we are today, I think, is an important place to begin. From a security perspective, no other country offers allies a comparable ability to live in peace without the need to maintain their own nuclear stockpiles and to stand up their own conventional defenses. And we see that in the legacy of the unparalleled networks of partnerships and alliances that the US continues to enjoy around the world, though the challenge is to make sure that remains true in the future. These are powerful and enduring advantages of American leadership that need to be nurtured, celebrated, protected, and we need to make sure that we continue to educate people on why they're so important. And that's ultimately what the point of our conversation today comes back to. In the new multipolar world, it's especially important to avoid making decisions that erode that power. And there have been some comments already today on this topic, but I want to say a few words about how important it is that we use our power carefully. It's important that the United States not force countries unnecessarily to make hard choices between competing world powers and to drive wedges in relationships that shouldn't have those wedges. The United States should not overuse its unique advantages as the world reserve currency when we reach beyond our borders, except for the most serious strategic and moral concerns. And then we should only do so in the context of a diplomatic strategy to achieve a policy objective, and whenever possible, with multilateral support. And following 4 years of erratic policy and an absence of international leadership, the US needs to show that it can follow through on its commitments and reclaim its leadership role in global undertakings. And we've, I think, seen a beginning of that if you look at the progress we've made this year on international corporate tax reform. There are many opportunities to demonstrate leadership. There's a bumper crop of urgent transnational problems that demand policy coordination. Responding to this pandemic and preparing for the next one, combating climate change, managing how we deal with a nuclear DPRK, and preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, and addressing the risks and opportunities that arise from the next generation of technologies, cyber, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and others. The United States needs to engage and lead. And that means getting back to the table, which will be a challenge at a time when global engagement faces political headwinds. It means making the case to the American people why this engagement is crucial for our economic well-being and security. But that's not new. We should all remember that the modern international order is named for Bretton Woods because it was the vote of a New Hampshire senator that was critical to winning congressional approval, even at the end of World War II. Finally, to extend US leadership in this new multipolar world, the most important steps the US can take are right here at home in our own democracy, ensuring that we protect our ideals, provide opportunity, take care of our people, and live our values, because the power of our example adds exponential strength to both our economic security and capability. I agree with Tom Christensen's comments on our need to engage and re-engage in things like TPP and CPTPP. But in order to do that, we need to convince the American people that that is in the interest of making our country stronger. Ensuring that our example remains the beacon for the world also comes down to what we, the people, do as citizens and how we choose our leaders. Our institutions of democracy set the model for the world, and whether our politics tilt left or right on economic and social policy, restoring global confidence that our democratic institutions are and will remain strong is the real key to our long-term economic and diplomatic success. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jack. This was very inspirational, as well as providing the right perspective. I think that indeed, and it relates to some of what was already said before, that indeed the United States needs to re-engage, to remain engaged. And the best way to do it is to provide security, provide leadership that's based on persuasion and being the role model, rather than forcing things. I think the issue also that you've mentioned that many countries don't fully realize is how much the US is introverted in many respects, that indeed one has to persuade people that the US should remain internationally engaged. The isolationism that we saw bit before the two world wars, etc., is still very much ingrained and needs to be dealt with. So I think that indeed carefully preparing the US foreign policy and executing with the approval of the political system and the people at the base of the democratic institutions is really, really very, very crucial here. It, I think, comes very nicely to our next speaker, which is Katharina Pistor, dear colleague from the law school. So we're coming back to the law school. Katharina is the Edwin B. Parker Professor of Comparative Law, has worked on a number of issues that combine economics, law, and political aspects, as well as philosophical aspects from a legal perspective. And so it's terrific to have her here. She's worked in a major way, has been recognized all over the world, and in Europe in particular has received some of the highest honors. So Katharina, it's great to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. And let me just start by saying that, of course, I had the honor of being a colleague of Richard's at the law school. I remember to this day that in the beginning of the term when I started teaching at Columbia, he was the first senior colleague to invite me to lunch. And it was just after 9/11 because I started teaching in September 2001. And he was both an inspiration to, retain hope in that kind of situation, which was emotionally draining and shocking and disturbing. But he also was very excited about having somebody on the faculty who was engaged in comparative and international affairs. I should say at the outset that I'm more a comparativist and micro-institutionalist than a globalist or internationalist in the way that Richard was, and maybe that also will color my remarks. I also want to just congratulate Jan for this wonderful chair, and also remember that we met sometimes in the 1990s. We and Jeff, of course, as well, were all deeply involved in the transition of the former socialist worlds. And the conferences that Jan helped organize on transition economies were some of the most inspirational intellectual endeavors that I had in my early time as a young academic. So thank you for that. Let me just start by saying that I think we have to rethink how to come together in a fractured global world. Our multilateral system does not work anymore, is my assessment. It's fractured. We also have new power centers that are not part of that multilateral system. And that's not only new powers such as China that have arisen, but it's also new economic powers. And economic powers are not subject to the same constraints that we have built for the global system. To the contrary, most of the economic powers are not responsible to almost anybody who might be negatively affected by them. So that's basically my reading and the backdrop to my comments. I'm basically arguing we have to return to the wonderful quote that Nina brought in at the beginning of the talk today. It's the dignity of man. And I wanted to make a pitch that in thinking about how to move forward in global affairs, we have to put human dignity at the center of attention. Not governance, not another economic toolkit, not another regime change. These are always indirect means by which we're trying to achieve certain outcomes. But given the limited time we have to achieve something to make or could retain the planet as being inhabitable for most people around the globe, and given the atrocities that we see around us, I think a return to fundamental norms and return to thoughts about how to achieve those norms by different means in different parts of the world is, in my view, critical. Of course, we always need some mechanisms to do that. I'm a lawyer after all, so I do recognize that. But I think that having an anchor in the norms also allows others, NGOs, civil society organizations, different agents to get around these causes and then lobby for mechanisms that make them implementable. So what do I mean when I talk about human dignity? Minimizing human suffering, of course, the elimination of bondage, oppression, and exploitation, the meeting of essential needs of humans around the world. But this also means that we need to identify causes and attribute responsibilities for the causes of human suffering. And that has to include not only public actors, but also private actors again. So why is multilateral governance insufficient today? Well, one reason, of course, is the political fragmentation, the lack of US leadership, and I think the concern from the outside of the United States that the US is not coming back. We don't know whether Trump will be back in 2024. We don't even know if he's not coming back, what else will replace him. The reliance on that power, I think, has diminished in many parts of the world, and I think rightfully so. I also would argue that the global governance structures have not delivered. They have not delivered on the human dignity front. When we think about human suffering today at our borders with migration, Nina mentioned that already. When we think about human suffering also inside countries like the United States, in prisons, in places where there are no jobs and where there is insufficient healthcare, etc. And of course, this is amplified wherever else we look in the world. Then hiding behind the shields of governance and new tools of economic policies is just not enough. They have to be measured against material, substantive outcomes. In the law, we always struggle about what is more important, what shall we focus on the substance or on the procedure, on the of material goals or on the form. And I think it's time to return to the material issues, the norms, the fundamental norms, and find the different tools by which we can achieve them wherever we can find them. We have dismantled quite a few tools that were relatively successful. I just think about the Alien Tort Statute in the United States that were used to some extent to hold corporations accountable for human rights atrocities. The Supreme Court has basically gutted that. The US has fought back against countries like Belgium that created universal jurisdiction for human rights abuses and to protect, of course, its own security apparatus and including foreign ministries, etc. But I think these are tools that one could strengthen, and I think we have to find more of those. Not everything can be solved through litigation, no, but I think we have to find ways to ensure that people can rise and try to enforce and make sure that these rights, fundamental rights, are being realized. So my pitch is basically, I don't think it's against Richard's own thinking. He wanted to think about the dignity of man. He was a man of his own time, of course. For him, multilateralism was the way to go, and he breathed it and he lived it. And these were also the remarks that he gave to me just after 9/11. We have to rebuild this multilateral order. But I think he also would have realized today that maybe we might need different tools. And true to his values, I'm just making a pitch for something that is more compatible with a fractured and very diverse world where different mechanisms might be needed to achieve the goals that I mentioned. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Katharina. Indeed, this is, I think, going to the fundamentals, and it's very important to go to the fundamentals and ask ourselves how we can rethink coming back together and reestablishing a multilateral system that is based on human dignity, respects it, focuses on it, and minimizes the suffering and the lack of basic freedoms and services that are needed. And we're coming back through your talk about to the question of the US leadership in this, however, whichever form it takes, and we've had a number of issues here discussed. to what extent can the rest of the world rely on it? To what extent can other countries complement it, supplement it? And what are the new tools and new institutions that can be brought to bear on that? So why don't we come back now to the panel and let you react to each other. I'll start it maybe with some questions that might lead it. Jeff, let me come back to you. You've provided a very inspirational and direct assessment at the beginning. You've heard some of the other panelists address similar or related issues. So if you were to construct in a way the US approach now to the key issues that you've identified and others mentioned, what would be the key fundamental pillars of that, and how to introduce them and maintain them?
Thanks a lot. Let me start with Katharina's remark right now, and to note that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of course, starts out in its first article with the universality of human dignity and the basis of human rights on the basis of universal human dignity. That charter will have its 75th birthday in 2023. And I think we should reintroduce the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to the new young generation of the world as something for them. It's a remarkable text, actually. It's a text that was born out of the Holocaust. It was a text that was born out of the ashes of World War II. It was a rare moment and configuration of global thinking that enabled a truly global document with Christian, Confucian, Jewish, and other traditions in that document. And I think it's a great treasure for the world, and we should build upon it. It would be nice for the United States to ratify the international covenants that come out of it. For instance, the economic, social, and cultural rights. One of the greatest weaknesses of American society is the failure to understand that there are economic rights, substantive rights, that those are actually, there were 4 freedoms of FDR, not just 2. One of them was freedom from want. Those are the Sustainable Development Goals. That's the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The 4th freedom, of course, was freedom from fear, where Roosevelt talked about worldwide disarmament. He didn't talk about peace through strength. He talked about worldwide disarmament. And we fail on that miserably right now. We have obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. All nuclear powers are supposed to be disarming. We're not even trying anymore to do that. So I just want to say that I've always viewed the multilateral system to have 2 pillars, the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. One, a procedural framework with the substance of don't go to war unless the Security Council authorizes it. And the second, or in obvious imminent self-defense. And the other pillar is the moral pillar. And we can't have a system that rests on either one or the other. And we now have a system that rests on none of them. So my own view is that I wrote a book a couple of years ago called A New Foreign Policy Beyond American Exceptionalism. Our biggest hang-up in the United States is we still think we lead. So we're not attending to these things because we still think we're in the leadership mode. But I feel like we're the character in the cartoon that's run off the cliff and doesn't realize that we're not on solid ground anymore. We want, and I think we need to build a multilateralism that does not depend on US exceptionalism, that does not depend on US primacy, that does not depend on US leadership, but rather on US cooperation. And there's a lot to unpack in that. But I actually believe we're the biggest obstacle right now, not China, not the autocracies, not others. I believe the US mindset is because we need to come up with a way to cooperate with others fruitfully. We have about 30 UN treaties we haven't ratified in the last 30 years. We stopped all multilateralism on our side. The Republican Party is dead set against the UN, after all. And this is our weakness internally that we also need to solve. But God, the time is very, very short, as Nina explained.
Thank you, Jeff. That was terrific. Let me turn to Tom Christensen. And Tom, I'll ask you a question that I sort of thought of asking you, but we also have one of our dear friends and colleagues at night who is here asking a question. So I'll combine the two. My question was, given that China is now applying to join the CPTPP, what is the significance of that, and how should the US, in some sense, be part or not be part, how it should react? And Ed Knight is asking, does the continuing political turmoil surrounding the 2020 election and threats to democratic institutions affect our ability to conduct economic diplomacy? So that, I think, could be another segue to look into it.
Yeah, thanks a lot. There's a lot of ironies in China's application to the CPTPP. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, to get to Jeff's comments a moment ago, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is not an American idea. It was raised by 4 members of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Organization who were frustrated with the lack of progress in the WTO, because the WTO, the problems with the WTO are not in the institution itself. It's that it doesn't go far enough to address the real economic challenges of the 21st century. And it needs to be reformed, not scrapped, in my opinion. And these 4 partners included Singapore. And I served in the Bush administration, and we started negotiating the TPP in the Bush administration. And we did so for a reason that's somewhat ironic. And it's been TPP has been labeled an American agenda initiative. It's been linked to President Obama's pivot to Asia. It's none of those things. What it was an attempt to create a more appropriate international agreement for the 21st century. And because Singapore was involved, we were attracted to it because we had a gold standard agreement with Singapore on a bilateral basis. And we knew that they were champions of internationalism in the economic sphere. And the goal was to create a very high standard agreement that covered intellectual property protection, investment, criticized states' subsidies of state-owned enterprises that were created unfair conditions, protected labor along the lines that Nina said. And we thought that this was a great idea, and that the real goal going in was to make China jealous. That if China was seeing the countries all around it and the United States form such an agreement, they would want in. They wouldn't want to be left out, and they would liberalize their economy and try to remove some of the very real obstacles the Chinese economy opposes to foreigners dealing with China. So it's tremendously ironic that the United States unilaterally pulled out of this agreement after President Obama was succeeded by President Trump, and Hillary Clinton in the campaign also ran against the TPP. So it's a bipartisan consensus that this treaty was not for America, and I think that was a terrible consensus. And now China's applying to join, and I hope that it actually makes the United States jealous, and that it gets us back involved in international multilateral economic negotiations, because we'll be jealous if China goes in. But my prediction, Jan, is a kind of sad one. I think what's actually going to happen is the United States is going to reach out to all the other members of the CPTPP bilaterally and tell them to keep the standards of the organization really high, so as to keep China out and don't let China water down the institutions, which is a fine goal, to not have the institution watered down. But it's kind of hypocritical of the United States, if we're not involved in the actual negotiations, to say, don't water down the standards of this institution. And I think that's sad. And in terms of the question about U.S. credibility in international agreement, I think it's extremely damaging that we did things like pull out of the TPP. Japan made a lot of sacrifices to help create that organization. A lot of domestic compromises were made. And then we just said, never mind, to countries like Japan. And there's a whole raft of international institutions that the Trump administration pulled out of unilaterally. And I think all international actors have to wonder what's going to happen in 2024 and whether just domestic political strife in the United States will prevent even a successor Democratic administration from, will allow them to actually make new agreements and stick to them. And we don't have a great track record, unfortunately, and reputation really matters in international politics. I'll close by remembering my mentor and friend, Robert Jervis, who taught us about the importance of reputation in international politics. And right now, the US reputation is not good.
Yeah. No, thank you, Tom. That's really important, and I'm sure other panelists will return to these issues as well. Let me, also take the occasion to really thank Ed Knight for providing important support for the chair and for SIPA. So we'd like to acknowledge that. That's really important, valuable, and thank you very much. Let me turn to Nina, and I was thinking it would be important to speak a little bit about the role of business in all this, because you have, one foot or significant part of your activities there as well. And let me bring in also the question that we have from Romas Debravi. He's asking, given that climate change, carbon elimination is the greatest challenge to the future of our planet, how would Richard bring the Glasgow decisions forward? You're the perfect person to answer.
Thank you, Roma, for that. And I salute you, old friend of my dad's from very beginning. The role of the private sector. Well, I'll tell you one thing. I think the private sector can either start getting on the right side of history, and if they're willing to lead, that's great. Otherwise, they have to get out of the way. I feel very strongly about that because enough is enough. Companies have to take a good hard look at how they are negatively impacting people and the planet through their emissions, through lack of adaptation, through poor labor standards, lack of diversity and inclusion, and focus on how they can positively impact the world and make profit, because it is also about that, by using the SDGs for guidance. And this is what the field of business and human rights and sustainability is about. This is what I teach. And I really think, and many companies are starting to make sort of these issues their business practice. This is not an add-on like corporate social responsibility or philanthropy, right? And investors have to apply the environmental, social, and governance risk analysis to companies they're invested in, not only in assessing risk to the company, but also about the communities they're impacting, right? And businesses start to have to start having diverse boards and executive committees, right? The SEC approved this August. I'm very happy that NASDAQ's proposal to require more than 3,000 companies listed to have at least one woman board member and one from a minority group, and to publicly disclose statistics on demographic composition of their boards. Okay, this is a beginning. Companies also, and I know Jeff knows all about this, companies have to stop using their massive dark money budgets. This is shareholder money in Washington to lobby against all the legislation that's critical to reach our growth, our green and equitable transition, right? So we need a carbon tax. We have to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, encourage more stringent SEC reporting requirements. We have to have universal health care. I could go on, but it's, this is where companies have to do. And Roma, to answer your question, I think my dad would have probably gone the way I have, in that, yes, multilateral institutions, but we have to bring in all the actors. And some of the bigger actors is business. These days, they're the ones that have the leverage. They're the ones that have the money, and they will be rewarded by consumers, socially responsible investors, and will attract our talented students who understand these issues, who are woke and expect more from the companies they go work for. Now, the Business Roundtable in August of 2019 advocated a shift from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. But they really need to follow these words with deeds. No one should have to die for the Dow. And many workers have done during this pandemic. And this is where I really think we have to harness the role of the good businesses. And as I said, those others can just get out of the way.
Thank you. And you've, in fact, in part, answered another question which has appeared here from Jonathan Jacoby from the Open Society Foundation, who has a great description. He says, Richard Gardner, whom we call Chairman Gardner in his remarkable seminar. Now, that's a real tribute to a professor to be called a chairman. So that's terrific. So he says, was a dear teacher and mentor of mine as a SIPA and Columbia Business School student in the mid-2000s. And since, thank you to my dear friend and colleague Nina, the deans and other esteemed speakers for honoring Chairman Gardner's legacy today. And the question which you provided in part answer to is, how can corporate due diligence, laws, and trade and investment rules be made fit for purpose? So other speakers are welcome in their remarks to address that as well. Let me turn to Jack Liu. And Jack, you've already said quite a lot. And as you see, the issues relating to the new institutions, China, AIIB, negotiations, and so on are clearly in your line of inquiry and expertise. So feel free to speak to that. And if you have time, you can also take some interesting issue that's facing us today, like, for instance, Russia's ongoing threat to Ukraine's sovereignty, and ask or answer the question of how the US and Western world should respond to that.
Thanks, John. And I actually think there's a direct link between the two. We don't live in a binary world of the US is a leader, isn't a leader. The world is different. The US is still a very significant force in the world. And the question is how we use our influence. If you look at the TPP, CTPP transition, it is a loss of US influence for us to have been pulling those countries along to high standards to then see a bipartisan turning away from it in the United States. A big mistake in terms of our economic and security interests in the region. The challenge is, the world doesn't stop. So things like AIIB emerge, where other countries come together, work with China to develop an institution. And to some extent, we did there what Tom was cautioning may be now the case with CPTPP. We urged other countries not to stay out, but to insist on high standards, to only get in if AIIB met high standards. I actually think we succeeded in that with AIIB in terms of the institution subscribing to high standards and so far meeting them. We didn't do very much to increase our leadership in the world because the process was such an ugly one. I think there's a risk that CPTPP ends up having some of the same, where we achieve policy objectives and lose some of our moral leadership. When you look at a situation on the use of sanctions, like the decisions that are coming up in Ukraine, it's an opportunity to do it in a different way. I mean, I think when you look at the sanctions that were put in place in 2014, in the case of Russia's actions then, we actually worked with Europe to put a sanctions regime in place that Europe held to more strongly than anyone expected them to, and which, while they're not given credit for having ended the conflict, actually froze the conflict and led to the Minsk Accords, which now are the thing we're going to need to go back to if there's ever going to be a resolution of the conflict. The question going ahead is, how do you resolve the differences between the US and Europe? Can we tell them what to do? Do we have to come together? And my view on the use of sanctions is sometimes less is more. If we get to the highest level where we in Europe can put maximum pressure on Russia, we're going to be more successful than if we go it alone and kind of dare Europe to choose us or others. That's hard in a time when, if you look at the political lay of the land in the United States, there'd be broad support for just shutting down Nord Stream 2, shutting down the pipeline. I actually see it as an opportunity to empower the US-European relationship to use how do we deal with Nord Stream 2 as a new lever that we didn't have in 2014 in terms of dealing with Russia. And if we find the pathway to doing it with Europe in a way that Europe can stick with it, I think we'll have a better outcome than if we take what looks like a tougher position and Europe won't stick with it.
Thank you very much, Jack. And that leads naturally to Katharina, who I think would be a natural one to answer or elaborate a little bit more on the issue of how much and what kind of global coordination, international coordination is necessary or desirable to move to the north towards the normative goal of human dignity, and in particular, what kind of tools, from sort of positive incentives to sanctions, etc. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Jan. So, I think the beauty of thinking about norms is that we are trying to find levers we're using the levers wherever we can find them. That can be in the domestic setting, that can be in the transnational, that can be in the global setting. We can also identify those mechanisms that work decisively against trying to maximize human dignity. And Nina already pointed out there are lots of corporations that do not live up to these standards and that cheer profits over literally everything else. And yes, you should not have to die for the dough. I haven't heard that before, but it's a good one. I think it's really important. I just want to make also comments on the transnational trade agreements and the bilateral trade agreements. Let's just remember that we have created legal instruments that allow private actors to sue governments, but the governments can't sue them. Right? They're rights without responsibilities. They're not part of the international legal order that we have. And precisely because we don't have tools to rein them in, into the contrary, and the US, I think, has taken a lead on that, is to maximize the rights of private actors transnationally, globally, in foreign countries as well. We have to think about other mechanisms to bring this back and to hold them to account. So I think the beauty is we can actually go home first. And when we do this, we sometimes realize it's actually really, really difficult. It might be more difficult sometimes to clean up back home than to project to the rest of the world that they should do better. But if we were able to do that, I think then maybe also the United States could come back to a leadership role and show how it could be done, and others might follow.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you very much. Let me just add a couple observations. I think we've had a terrific discussion in the sense of the array of issues, the complementary views on the importance of the various issues. And, it comes to the fundamental question of the role of the United States and nowadays other countries where we're moving to a much more multipolar world. And it is different when you think of what the world looked like from the World War II to the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was a severe competition between the Soviet and the US led parts of the world. But by the 1970s or so, it was clear that economically the Soviet model was not working and would not work going forward. I think now we have a situation where the Chinese model economically works and has worked for over 40 years, a remarkable achievement that has not been matched by any country in the world, at least not in modern history. And so it is a complicated issue. It is a, sort of like moving from a monopoly to a game theoretic situation where you have many important players. And the issues of diplomacy and how you reach positive outcomes is much more formidable than it has been in the recent past, and how to do it peacefully. And so in a way, I think that today's discussion was really tremendous. I'd like to thank you all. I hope that Richard Gardner would be pleased to hear this discussion that came as inspiration from him and his work amongst us. I think that Columbia SIPA Law School should be proud of have people like yourself here. And I would like to thank you from my own perspective, assuming the Richard and Gardner chair, for coming as colleagues and friends to engage in this scintillating discussion. And I'd like to thank all the participants, everybody who came and listened and participated in the discussion. So thank you very much. And Dean Janow, if you're there, I'll give you time to conclude. Otherwise, I'll conclude myself. But you're there. Perfect. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I am here. This has been a wonderful exchange. I've been holding myself back from weighing in, but Richard, so much listening to all of you, such valuable perspectives. Thank you, Jan. You could moderate and enhance any conversation. And thank you for your wonderful interventions and leadership here. And most of all, thanks to all of those who are attending, who honor Richard Gardner and think about our changing world. Thank you all very much.